Elton John's hands left the keys. Not at the end of a phrase, not at a rest. In the middle of a chord, with the sustain still hanging in the air of the studio, his fingers simply lifted and held there above the ivory, trembling slightly, and Elton John himself went completely, utterly still. Jimmy Fallon had been standing at the edge of the stage with his arms crossed and a smile on his face. The comfortable smile of a man watching someone do the thing they were born to do. And then the smile was gone. Because Elton John had stopped playing, and his eyes were fixed on something in the back of the room that no one else could see. It was a Tuesday evening taping. October 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Elton John was the guest. A living legend at 76 years old, making one of his final American television appearances as his farewell Yellow Brick Road tour drew to its close. A tour that had lasted 5 years and crossed 5 continents and said goodbye in a way that only Elton John could, loudly and tenderly, and with every sequin accounted for. 300 people had packed into those seats knowing they were in the presence of an ending. The audience was electric before he even walked out. When he finally appeared, moving carefully but with the bearing of a man who had earned every step, the room rose as one and stayed there for nearly a full minute. The interview had been rich and warm. Stories from the Troubadour in 1970. A memory about Bernie Taupin that made Jimmy cover his face with both hands. The band settled behind the piano. The cameras found their angles. And then Elton John began to play. And everything in that room was exactly right. And then, from somewhere near the back of the studio, just beyond the last row of seats, a face appeared in the gap between the curtain and the wall, not moving, not signaling, not doing anything at all. Just a face. Older, a man in his 80s, standing very still in a gray cardigan, watching the stage. Not loud. Not intrusive. Just present. The way a face is present when it has traveled a very long way to be in a particular room. Elton John's hand stopped. His body stiffened slightly. The way a person stiffens when something they believed was gone forever suddenly is not. His head turned with the slowness of someone who does not trust what they think they are seeing. His eyes found the face in the back of the room and stayed there. His chin dropped. His mouth opened slightly. And the expression that crossed his face was not surprise exactly. It was older than surprise. It was the expression of a man recognizing something he had been carrying for 50 years. Jimmy stepped forward. "Elton? You okay?" Nothing. Elton John's eyes did not move from the back of the room. The entire studio froze. The band stopped. 300 people who had come to witness a farewell found themselves holding their breath, uncertain whether they were watching a health crisis unfold or something else entirely, something they did not yet have a name for. He was 76. He had been on an exhausting world tour. Was he unwell? Had something happened? The producer in the control booth did not cut to commercial. The cameras kept rolling. Nobody moved. And then Elton John spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by his microphone. Thomas. Just that. One name. A name that meant nothing to anyone in that studio except the man standing in the back of the room and the man sitting at the piano who had not said it aloud in 44 years. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1979. Elton John was not always Elton John, the icon. In 1979, the name Elton John was one of the most famous names on the planet, and also one of the most precarious. The albums had slowed. The costumes had become armor. The person wearing them had become someone he no longer entirely recognized. and the loneliness of that particular kind of fame, the kind that fills every room and empties the person at the center of it, had reached a depth that the concerts and the crowds and the standing ovations could not touch. He was 32 years old. He was exhausted in a way that sleep could not repair, and he was about to do something that almost no one around him understood. It was a September afternoon in Edinburgh, Scotland. A small recording studio off Leith Walk, the kind of room that smelled of cigarettes and damp wool and electrical tape, with 2 windows that looked out onto a cobblestone lane where pigeons walked with the unhurried confidence of animals that have never been late for anything. Elton had rented the space privately, without his management's knowledge, for 3 days. He had told no one what he was doing there. He was not recording an album. He was sitting at a rented upright piano in a small Scottish room, playing songs that no one would ever hear, trying to remember why he had started. Thomas Calloway was 67 years old. He was the studio's caretaker and sound engineer, a man who had worked in that building for 22 years and who treated every musician who came through with the same quiet, unhurried courtesy, a cup of tea when you arrived, a clean ashtray on the console. The particular gift of making no demands on a person's time or attention. He had white hair cut, very short, large hands, roughened by decades of coiling cables and carrying equipment, and the manner of a man who had spent a lifetime listening to other people make music without ever needing to be thanked for what he provided. On the second afternoon, he knocked on the studio door and asked, without ceremony, if it would be all right if he sat in the corner, not to comment, not to watch in any particular way, just to sit. Elton said yes, and Thomas Calloway sat in the wooden chair in the corner of that Edinburgh room and listened while Elton John played, for 2.5 hours, every half-finished song and borrowed melody and quiet thing he had never been able to finish in a proper studio with proper engineers and proper expectations pressing down on every note. He played the way you only play when you believe no one important is listening, which is to say, he played the truth. When he finally stopped, Thomas said one sentence. He said, "The songs you play when you're not performing are the best songs you have." And then he was quiet again. They talked that evening over tea in the small kitchen at the back of the building. Thomas had grown up in Aberdeen. He had wanted to be a musician himself once, before the practicalities of a life with a wife and a son had directed him toward the quieter work of making rooms where other people could be what he could not. He said this without bitterness. He said it the way a person describes a road they chose not to take, with full knowledge that the road they took had its own destinations worth arriving at. His son was 17, studying mathematics. Thomas was very proud. Before Elton left Edinburgh on the 3rd morning, Thomas handed him something. A small notebook, spiral-bound, the cover worn soft. A notebook that Thomas had been using for 15 years to write down phrases that struck him while listening to musicians record, not lyrics, not music, just language that seemed to carry the same weight as music. Things people said when they thought no one was writing anything down. He had been keeping it, he said, because language that honest was too valuable to lose. He told Elton to take it. He said he had a feeling Elton would need it more than he would. Elton took the notebook. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. 3 months later, he began the work that would eventually become some of the most personal songs of his career. Music that the critics called a return to form. Music that his collaborator Bernie Taupin said came from somewhere deeper than anything they had written together before. The notebook went into the piano case. It traveled with him to every studio session for the next decade. Then, the tours picked up again, and the momentum of the life carried him forward the way momentum does, fast and total, and leaving almost no room to look back. Thomas Calloway, had returned to Edinburgh after that September. He cared for that studio for 8 more years and then retired to a small flat in Morningside with his wife Margaret, who made shortbread that the neighbors still talked about. He listened to Elton John's music on the radio. He read the reviews that described the return to form. He felt something quiet and private when he heard certain songs, a particular satisfaction, the kind that asks for nothing in return because the act itself was already complete. He never wrote. He never reached out. That was not the kind of man he was. Margaret passed away in 2017. Thomas was 81 years old, living alone, and his son, who had long since stopped being a mathematics student and become a mathematics professor at the University of Edinburgh, noticed in the spring of 2023 that his father had begun to speak about that September in 1979 with the frequency of a man taking inventory of the things that had mattered. His son wrote a letter. He addressed it to Elton John's charitable foundation, not expecting anything, because you do not write a letter like that expecting anything. But he wrote it because his father was 87 years old, and the doctor had used words in January that had settled over the family like a change in weather. The foundation forwarded the letter. Elton read it on a tour bus somewhere between cities. He read it twice. He sat with it for a long time. Then he asked his personal assistant to find out everything she could about Thomas Calloway of Morningside, Edinburgh, and to make certain that a man named Thomas Calloway had a seat in the Tonight Show studio on the evening of October the 17th. Behind the scenes, Elton John had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He had not told Jimmy Fallon. He had not told the Tonight Show producers. He had told only his tour manager, who had coordinated with the venue to ensure that a man named Thomas Calloway was collected from his hotel that evening, brought through a side entrance, and given a place to stand near the back curtain where he could see the stage without being seated among the general audience. Elton had told his tour manager one thing. He said, "I do not want him to feel like a surprise. I want him to feel like a guest." The producers knew only that an additional private guest had been requested at the artist's personal direction. They had asked no further questions. Thomas Calloway had been standing in that gap in the curtain for 11 minutes before Elton John's hands left the keys. He had been watching the stage the way he had always watched musicians, quietly, from the side, without inserting himself into the sightline of anything important. His son stood behind him with one hand on his shoulder. Thomas himself was very still. He was 87 years old, and he was wearing the same gray cardigan he wore on Sundays, and his face held the expression of a man who had been given something he had not asked for and did not know how to hold. Now the studio was silent. Elton John's eyes had not left the back of the room. Jimmy Fallon stood at the edge of the stage, his hand raised toward the band to hold them where they were, his eyes moving between Elton and the curtain and back again, trying to understand what the room was becoming. Elton John stood up from the piano bench. He stood slowly and carefully, with the care of a man who had spent the last 5 years of his performing life moving carefully and had learned to do it without apology. He walked to the front of the stage. He stopped. He looked at the back of the room for one long moment. And then he stepped down from the stage and walked up the center aisle of the Tonight Show studio. 300 people did not move, not because they were directed not to, because they understood without being told. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Elton John reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and he brought out a notebook. Small, spiral-bound, the cover worn to the texture of old cloth, the kind of object that has spent decades inside a jacket rather than on a shelf. He held it in both hands as he walked. When he reached Thomas Calloway, he stopped. He looked at the old man in the gray cardigan, His eyes were already filled. He held the notebook out without speaking. Thomas looked down at it. His hands came up slowly and took it. He turned it over once. Then again. His fingers recognized the cover before his mind had finished the calculation. His chin began to tremble. "You kept this," Thomas said. His voice was almost nothing. Elton's voice cracked completely. Every session, every studio, every time I sat down at a piano and felt like I had lost it, I opened that notebook. And I found it again. Thomas looked up at him. His son's hand tightened on his shoulder. "I was just the man who made the tea," Thomas said. Elton shook his head, tears streaming openly down his face, not attempting to stop them. "You were the only person who ever told me the truth about my own music. Do you understand what that is worth?" Thomas Calloway pressed his lips together. His hands held the old notebook against his chest. 300 people rose to their feet. Jimmy Fallon sat down in a chair at the side of the stage and put his face in his hands, not hiding it, just resting there with it for a moment. Overtaken, Questlove set his sticks down on the snare without a sound. The director in the control room left the cameras where they were and did not cut to anything. Then Elton John turned back to the piano. He sat down. He opened the notebook on the piano's music stand, the way he must have opened it 1,000 times before in recording rooms and hotel suites and tour buses across 40 years of mornings when the music needed finding. And he played. Without the band, without introduction, the quietest thing he had played all night. Thomas Calloway returned to Edinburgh 3 days after that Tuesday taping. The notebook went back to its place in the inside pocket of his jacket, where it had spent the preceding 44 years. He passed away the following February, on a Sunday morning, with his son reading to him from a mathematics textbook that had been his son's first publication, a book Thomas had kept on his bedside table since the year it was printed. At the memorial service, his son spoke for 7 minutes. He said his father had lived by a single principle, that the most valuable thing you can give another person is honest attention. The notebook now sits in the Elton John archive in London. On the inside front cover, in Elton John's own handwriting, are 4 words written sometime in the last year. They read, "Thomas was right. Always, some people hold a door open without ever knowing who walks through it.